Rust eats steel slowly. Empires rot from within overnight. Thick dust, sticky with the sweat of others, choked parched throats. The sound of dull thuds against flesh was drowned out by the death rattles of thousands. The rough stone underfoot quickly grew slick with fresh blood. This wasn't some noble struggle for freedom. It was a methodical slaughter, bought and paid for in cold, hard gold. How is the most formidable army of the ancient world born? Do you think it is forged in the crucible of some great national feat? The truth is much uglier. The most terrifying military machine in human history began with a banal, massive bribe. Here is a historical paradox. Absolute, blind, legendary loyalty originally had a precise weight in silver coins. To whom will you be loyal until your last breath if your commander-in-chief has already sold your lives for a handful of shiny metal? What would you feel, standing on this land soaked in bile and fear, knowing that your death is just a dry line in someone else's ledger? The Medes ruled the ancient East with arrogance. They reveled in their own impunity. Their satraps gorged themselves from heavy gold plates, wrapped themselves in silk, and took the submission of their neighbors as a stagnant given. While the masters feasted, their vassals swallowed dust. But for decades, the Persians nursed a quiet, searing fury. This rage ripened in the cold shadows. It pulsed like poison in the veins of every beggar herdsman and every humiliated tribal chief. The wait was agonizingly long. And when the time finally came, the old world shuddered. After long decades of humiliating silence, Cyrus the Great stepped onto the sun-drenched stage. Forget the pretty fairy tales about noble liberators. Cyrus wasn't some wide-eyed idealist. He was a brutal, pragmatic architect of a new reality. He understood the fundamental truth. Raw fury isn't enough. Rage without an iron bit is just a blind riot that quickly chokes on its own vomit. Cyrus needed a foolproof system. No sentimental speeches about the brotherhood of nations, only cold, hard, political calculation. He looked at the glittering, arrogant ranks of the Median nobility and didn't see formidable, invincible enemies. He saw price tags hanging off them. Why bash your head against a thick stone wall when you can just buy the gatekeeper? Cyrus didn't waste men to honestly overthrow his masters. He methodically bought out the enemy elite. The heavy wooden spear rubbed palms into bloody, bursting blisters. A rank-and-file Median infantryman grits his teeth, staring into the encroaching dark wall of Persian shields. The unbearable heat mercilessly blinds his inflamed eyes. Any second now, a sharp command should ring out to form a tight phalanx. He waits for the saving shout of his commander. Salty sweat stings his eyelids, eating into his toughened skin. But instead of the signal to attack, he hears the dull, heavy thud of weapons being dropped onto the dry earth. He turns his head in a panic. His general, whose chest is covered in expensive embossed plates, coolly walks behind the Persian line. Heavy purses weigh down the traitors' belts. A stab in the back is always delivered by those who swore loudest to lead you into a victorious battle. Media's top generals laid down their swords without even drawing them from their scabbards. The great power didn't fall to a battering ram. It rotted alive, sold out by its own defenders. And on these smoking ruins, reeking of deception, the pragmatic Cyrus began to forge his ultimate weapon. He ruthlessly handpicked the best, the strongest, the most resilient predators. From this living human material, he forged an unprecedented strike force. This wasn't a tribal militia of free men. It was history's first legalized death conveyor, bound by fanatical loyalty to a new master. As a contemporary of those terrible events wrote, They sold their souls for the right to stand in the shadow of the throne, and their swords became a mindless extension of the king's hand. Brutal barracks discipline burned everything personal out of them with a hot iron, leaving only a raw killer reflex and animal devotion. A new, absolutely ruthless force was being born. Could you keep your sanity, realizing that your principles are just a commodity on the imperial market? Some built empires on blind faith, others on fragile freedom. But the Persians chose to erect theirs on total control and clinking coins. Gold bought the betrayal of the old masters in abundance, but it was the blood of others that was meant to permanently seal the foundation of this never-before-seen machine. While the dust of the fallen Median kingdom slowly settled on one shore of history, a new, even more destructive storm was brewing in the stifling training camps. Cyrus watched his marching ranks intently and understood clearly. For this mechanism to instill primal, paralyzing terror, it had to stop being just a crowd of people. It had to be transformed forever into an unchangeable, cold, mathematical value. While the ash of old kingdoms settled on the scorched plains, a new, geometrically precise nightmare was being born on the parade grounds of Persepolis. Cyrus hated chaos. He despised the unpredictability of battle. For the great king, war had ceased to be an art for brave men. It became cold, ruthless bookkeeping. He established a strict headcount for his elite corps, exactly 10,000 men. Not one more, not one less. In the ancient world, this number represented an overwhelming, insurmountable limit. This wasn't just an army, it was a steel steamroller, crushing the enemy's will before the first sword was even swung. Forget the naive ballads about lone heroes. The real, visceral horror of this army didn't lie in the sharpness of their iron spears. It hid in the creaking papyrus scrolls of the royal quartermasters. This was the first industrialization of war in human history. The Corps' legendary fame was built on monstrous, seamless logistics. The focus shifted forever from personal valor to a system of continuous death supply. A man ceased to be an individual with his own name. He was reduced to a banal, completely interchangeable gear in a massive state machine. An enemy hoplite grips the hilt of his short sword until his knuckles crack. The wood slips treacherously with someone else's sticky blood. The thick air is saturated with the nauseating smell of split bellies and rusted iron. His lungs burn with every gasping breath. The hoplite makes a desperate, superhuman lunge. The bronze tip punches through a wicker shield and the scale armor of a Persian guardsman with a dull thud. The enemy slumps heavily into the dry mud. The hoplite greedily gulps down the hot dust. He desperately hopes for a single second of respite, but the gap in the monolithic formation closes instantly. The mangled corpse is silently dragged by the feet to the rear ranks. In his place, with a quiet metallic clank, steps an absolutely identical double. The same empty, indifferent gaze, the same armor glinting in the unbearable sun, the same measured step. The hoplite's mind suffers an irreparable fracture. He realizes with primal horror that he has just killed a void. At that exact moment, it wasn't defensive tactics that finally broke. It was the human psyche. The illusion of immortality paralyzes an exhausted enemy more effectively than the deadliest poison. But every perfect illusion has its cynical director. He always pulls the strings from a safe, cool tent while others drown in their own blood. The essence of their terrifying power lay in strict mathematical replaceability. You can, with great effort, repel the furious attack of a berserk barbarian. You can outsmart a greedy mercenary, but you cannot stop a methodically rolling ocean tide. The system of inexhaustible replenishment terrified doomed opponents to the point of animal trembling. The quiet dread of an infinite mass robbed even the most experienced generals of sleep. Every death on the front line was accounted for in advance. Every human loss was paid for in advance. Cold-eyed bureaucrats dryly crossed out the names of the dead in their long scrolls. Those same bureaucrats, with the same bureaucratic indifference, wrote in the names of fresh cannon fodder. What would you feel, coming face to face with an opponent who fundamentally refuses to die? Could you force yourself to raise a heavy weapon again against a wall that instantly heals its gaping wounds? As a Spartan chronicler of those doomed days coldly noted, "We do not celebrate the fall of a single Persian, for behind his back stand 10,000 identical silent shadows, biding their time." These words sounded like a desperate death sentence for the entire ancient world. The mechanical nightmare marched steadily across the planet. It left behind only shattered bones and submissively bowed heads. No unnecessary sentiment on the battlefield. No human compassion for fallen comrades. Only the paralyzing inevitability of the encroaching black wave. This military machine ground up entire defiant nations with the dull indifference of heavy wooden millstones. The individual, brilliant heroism of the defenders was smashed to pieces against the dry mathematics of the attackers. In the command tents of the royal quartermasters, it smelled sweetly of expensive incense, not sour soldier sweat. There, they leisurely drew straight lines on expensive parchment. Every such thin line meant thousands of ruined human lives. High commanders viewed rank-and-file soldiers exclusively as useful, expendable material. The stockpiles of this living material could always be quickly replenished from the bottomless reserve warehouses of the great empire. Some naive rulers wore their knees bloody, tearfully praying to fickle gods for a miraculous salvation. Others simply brought the logistics of organized death to a point of absolute, mathematically precise sadism. But for this colossal abstraction to work flawlessly and without failure on a long march, it required perfect, submissive parts. To keep the living gears from jamming at the most critical moment of a bloody battle, they had to be properly cast and brutally tempered. A human is never born a soulless, obedient cog. He must be forged diligently, methodically, and with extreme sadism. While gray-haired veterans on the front lines slowly went mad from the encroaching immortal wave, deep in the safe rear of the empire, childhood was being ruthlessly ground into dust. While royal scribes in conquered Babylon kept a dry tally of the fallen, in the dusty camps at the foot of the Zagros, human nature itself was being ruthlessly ground into powder. Empires don't need loving sons. Empires need foolproof inventory. At the age of 10, boys were torn from their mothers forever. These weren't destitute orphans. These were the children of the highest Persian nobility, the future masters of the ancient world. But here, behind the thick stone walls of the training reservations, their noble blood wasn't worth a gulp of foul well water. The elite aren't raised with lullabies. The elite are seared by the white-hot iron of legalized deprivation. 10 long years of continuous, methodical hell. That was how long it took to purge a child of the capacity for doubt. Forget about warm hearths. Only bare, frozen ground. Only brutal drilling from the first light of dawn until the first bloody blisters. They were taught one craft: to kill quickly, methodically, and with absolutely no emotion. Yesterday's heirs to vast fortunes fought to the death for a piece of moldy bread. They ate meager forage. They caught steppe rats with their bare hands just to survive until the next dawn. Hunger became their primary teacher. Daily animal fear of the overseer burned away the fear of a future enemy's blade. As the instructors of those years coldly lectured, "Pity makes your hand heavy, and a dead man has no use for a heavy hand." They learned to deliver fatal blows with terrifying indifference. No questions, no doubts. The commander's order must always precede one's own thought. Your pathetic life no longer belongs to you. You are just a piece of raw, pliable clay on the endless potter's wheel of imperial war. A boy feverishly grips a battered training sword. He is only 13. His fingers are permanently curled from the night cold. Under broken fingernails, someone else's dried blood turns black. Yesterday, during a forced march through the scorching desert, his best friend fell. The rule of the death camp is simple. He who falls always stays in the sand. The boy didn't even look back. He forced himself to look only at the sweaty back of the person in front of him. His throat was parched from the hot dust, and his beating heart had turned into a heavy stone. At that exact moment, he ceased to be a satrap's beloved son. He became a perfect part of the state mechanism. 40% of boys just as strong broke forever. Their fragile psyches suffered a fatal crack under the weight of daily sadism. They were ruthlessly discarded as useless slag. The state machine contemptuously spat out those who dared to show the slightest weakness. Only monsters with empty eyes survived. Could you look calmly into the eyes of a mother whose son you coolly left to die in the scorching dunes for the sake of an overseer's praise? The surviving cadets had long since stopped asking themselves such questions. The physiology of exhaustion dictated its own harsh rules. Aching muscles were constantly racked by cramps. Stomachs shriveled into knots from lack of food. But this hunger gave birth to a phenomenal endurance for pain. It was the most brutal form of selection. If you cannot silently endure the searing pain of a whip's lash, you will never stand under a hail of Greek arrows. Barracks cruelty became the only norm they knew. The smell of acrid sweat, copper rust, and pervasive dust replaced the scent of home forever. They emerged from these brutal camps as flawless instruments of murder, foolproof machines without a past or their own desires. But any cynical ruler knows one immutable truth. Raw fanaticism is an extremely unstable fuel. Sooner or later, a trained hound might tear out its own master's throat. To confidently keep these silent monsters in submission, fear alone was no longer enough. It's not enough to just show a wild beast the whip. You must throw the predator the fattest bone. Terror forges blind obedience, but only fabulous greed and the glitter of privilege make it truly eternal. A golden chain always holds tighter than rusted iron. The great kings of Persia learned this cynical lesson well. A two-legged beast trained in death camps is ready to tear anyone apart at the first harsh command. But to ensure the hungry monster doesn't one day bite through its short leash, its toothy maw must be generously smeared with sweet fat. Forget the beautiful, high-flown myths about blind patriotism. Lofty speeches about duty are cheap, substitute fuel for the destitute infantry. The elite always demand hard, cold currency. The absolute, legendary loyalty of the Corps was bought with fabulous material wealth, unthinkable for the rest of the ancient world. Each of the 10,000 regularly received triple pay in full-weight silver. They were granted massive landholdings in the empire's most fertile provinces. They personally owned tens of thousands of disenfranchised slaves. Yesterday's broken, terrified boys who ate raw rats in filthy training pits were rapidly turning into arrogant millionaires with sharp swords. The state quite deliberately pumped these killers full of incredible wealth. This wasn't a noble gesture of mercy. It was an incredibly subtle, truly brilliant political calculation. Give a man something he will be deathly afraid to lose, and he will gladly rip the throat out of anyone who threatens it. A furious, greedy property owner on the battlefield always fights 100 times more viciously than an ideological fanatic. These thugs, encased in armor, went to the bloody slaughter not for the abstract greatness of a distant crown. They went to protect their own personal, stuffed chests. Behind the perfectly marching, geometrically straight line stretched a completely different, hidden world. Heavy, unbearably creaking wagons piled high with looted goods. Enormous luxury tents sewn from the finest Eastern silk. Hundreds of submissive concubines in translucent garments, their fragile wrists jingling melodically with heavy gold bracelets. The thick scent of sweet, intoxicating incense and freshly roasted meat mixed paradoxically and sickeningly with the stifling stench of corpses from the front line. The contrast was truly monstrous. Filth and luxury had merged forever. A gray-haired veteran tiredly removes his heavy helmet, thick with the splattered blood of others. His face is covered in a dense crust of ingrained dust. His hands tremble noticeably from the monstrous overexertion. Only an hour ago, he was methodically, like a butcher at a market, gutting screaming enemy spearmen. Now, he sinks heavily onto the soft, plush carpets in his private, guarded tent. Before him stands a massive wooden chest. He greedily runs his roughened, battle-broken fingers through the cold coins. The metal pleasantly cools his inflamed skin. Nearby, a young slave girl with a clay jar of tart wine stands frozen, her eyes downcast. He doesn't think about his great ruler. He thinks only of the fact that in the event of a sudden defeat, all this personal splendor will instantly go to some filthy barbarian. The very same barbarian whose ribcage he just coolly smashed with his shield. His hardened heart doesn't tighten from a burning love for his motherland. It tightens painfully from the primal fear of losing his investments. And tomorrow, he will go out to butcher living people with redoubled, sadistic fury. Tomorrow, he will once again be the perfect, foolproof executioner. Could you yield even an inch of dry earth to the enemy, knowing for certain that behind you stand your personal supply wagons of silver, for which you endured 10 long years of inhuman torture? The question is entirely rhetorical. The system worked ruthlessly. The system worked flawlessly. They ceased to be mere conscripts. They had finally transformed into well-armed, merciless shareholders of a giant corporation. They weren't defending the blurred borders of a vast state. They were ferociously defending their own tangible dividends. Some built high walls to keep death at bay. Others forged sharp swords to bring that death. But loyalty was always sold to the one who paid more than the rest. But such a sophisticated, cynical scheme always harbors a hidden, fatal flaw. Human greed knows no logical saturation point. The longer the golden chain becomes, the heavier it is to drag across the endless, rutted roads of war. The personal baggage trains of the elite grew relentlessly until they reached monstrous proportions. A formidable army was dragging an entire, sluggish, buzzing city of luxury in its wake. The speed of operational maneuver inevitably plummeted. Mobility was consciously sacrificed for comfort. Expensive luxury eroded morale more slowly, but far more surely than an enemy's poison. The machine kept running, its well-oiled gears turning dutifully, grinding the bones of dissenters. But deep inside, the first unnoticed rust of decay had already appeared. Imperial propaganda trumpeted the total invincibility of its hounds, but the true, ruthless test of this bloated golden mechanism would not come from a clash with living men. Men always break. They break predictably under the weight of steel. They are bought with cold, hard cash, or they flee in a panic, blinded by primal fear. But how do you bribe an oncoming sandstorm? What exactly do you offer the scorching midday sun to make it stop burning your inflamed eyes alive? Real, paralyzing horror awaited these arrogant, wealthy men where the beaten trade routes ended forever, and the endless, merciless, scorching sand began. The scorching sands of the Sinai do not take bribes. The imperial hounds had to learn this simple, monstrous truth the hard way. The mad pragmatist Cambyses threw his golden mechanism into the heart of the inferno. He needed the fertile Nile Valley, and so he led his army through hell. Here, the sun itself became the enemy commander-in-chief. The wells ran completely dry on the third day of the grueling march. Precious water quickly turned into foul-smelling sludge. Men began to drop. The invincible system of continuous replenishment suffered its first terrible misfire. In the place of one who dropped dead from thirst, stood another who was himself one step away from total madness. Skin cracked from the unbearable heat. Lips were covered in a black crust. Yet the iron order drove them only forward. They marched heavily, leaving behind a gruesome trail of desiccated corpses. It was the harshest baptism by fire. But they made it. Haggard, insanely vicious, ready to tear anyone apart with their bare hands for a single gulp of moisture. At the high walls of Pelusium, a fresh army of the Egyptian pharaoh awaited them. Shimmering armor even, tight ranks. This was not a typical tactical battle. This was a swift, punitive action by enraged demons. In a single day, the pride of ancient Egypt was brutally ground into bloody dust. As a mercenary of those years dryly noted, the Persians didn't fight at all. They methodically took out their primal rage on us for every step taken across that cursed wasteland. The killing machine proved its unfailing efficiency. They smashed through the enemy defenses in one steel surge. The Egyptians threw down their weapons in animal terror and fell to their knees, but the blind machine knew absolutely no mercy. The order was dead simple: exterminate everyone. Faceless killers marched over crunching bones. Blood soaked deep into the sand, forming a sticky quagmire. Corpses carpeted the dry earth in a solid layer. The victors literally could not set a boot on clean stone. It was an absolute, crushing triumph. The Empire noisily celebrated the great victory. It seemed there was no force in the known world capable of stopping this avalanche. A loud victory is always deeply intoxicating, but absolute power quickly strips rulers of their last shreds of sanity. Cambyses became completely blinded by his own impunity. In a fit of paranoid pride, he gave a mad order, sending 50,000 of his best warriors deep into the great desert. Among them marched the soldiers of the elite corps, obedient as ever. Their goal was the distant oracle of Ammon. Their task was to burn the ancient temple of the defiant deity to the ground. The massive army left the life-saving oases forever. The straight columns stepped confidently into the boundless dunes, and no one ever saw them again. Not a single miraculous survivor, not a single broken spear. 50,000 well-armed men vanished without a trace into the scorching air. A veteran of the Egyptian campaign leans heavily on a smooth spear shaft. His inflamed eyes water from the all-pervading dust. The sky is turning black rapidly. The air becomes thick and unbearably heavy, burning the throat like the fiery breath of a furnace. Suddenly, the horizon explodes with a roaring wall of sand. The hurricane hits with incredible physical force. Commanders scream orders frantically, but their voices are instantly drowned out by the diabolical howl of the elements. The seasoned soldier drops to his knees, desperately trying to cover his face with the edge of his cloak. Sand ruthlessly packs into his nose, tears at his exhausted lungs, and scrapes his gums. Breathing becomes absolutely impossible. A heavy gold bracelet relentlessly pulls his numb hand toward the ground. Not long ago, he had killed in cold blood for this metal at Pelusium. Now, it is just a deadly weight. He slowly suffocates. Around him, thousands of elite warriors scramble in blind panic. They collide with force, striking out blindly. The vaunted army has turned into a swarm of helpless insects. The desert indifferently buries them alive. After long weeks of ringing silence, an oppressive pause hung in the royal tent. Quartermasters with trembling hands didn't know how to properly record these colossal losses. The state apparatus had encountered an enemy that could not be bribed or listed as a traitor. Their perfect logistics proved utterly powerless. Fabulous wealth couldn't buy a single breath of fresh air. What would you say to your almighty lord, knowing that half of his pride had forever become vulture fodder? Some smugly erect monuments to their triumphs, while others try to erase the memory of monstrous failures. But nature always collects its debts without witnesses. The proud machine had suffered a fatal crack. The surviving portion of the elite returned, and the empire greedily licked its wounds. The external threat had temporarily receded, but when swords find no foreign blood, a tyrant's gaze always turns inward, transforming former heroes into the attack dogs of the secret police. While the sands ruthlessly picked clean the bones of those fallen in the wastes, the very nature of power was rapidly changing in the shadows of Persepolis's palace columns. By the end of the 6th century BC, the great empire was bloated with fresh blood and looted silver. The external borders were temporarily pacified, but Darius the Great possessed the instinct of a seasoned, paranoid predator. He knew perfectly well that the most terrifying blow is always delivered to the back, struck by those who bow the lowest at lavish receptions. The vast realm was creaking threateningly at the seams from the hidden hatred of conquered peoples. To keep this colossal, boiling cauldron from exploding, external war inevitably had to become internal war. The romance of the open battlefield died forever. The legendary Army Corps mutated relentlessly into a giant, punitive apparatus. They returned from grueling campaigns not as celebrated heroes, but as the ruthless gendarmes of the crown. Darius methodically stationed his attack dogs in all the key provinces of the vast country, from rebellious Babylon to conquered, resentful Egypt. Now their main task was not to crush enemy phalanxes. Their new objective was to burn out any seditious thought with a red-hot iron. The fine-tuned system of continuous death replenishment was perfectly suited for organizing non-stop state terror. Senior officers of the Corps settled permanently in every satrapy, becoming political overseers, silent, heavy shadows behind the backs of local governors. They sat at others' rich feasts, listened intently to others' whispers, and killed in cold blood at the slightest suspicion. The dim light of an oil lamp catches drops of cold sweat from the thick gloom. A Babylonian nobleman clutches the edge of an embroidered silk pillow with trembling hands. Behind the thick wooden door of his bedroom, a heavy, measured step rings out. Metal grinds quietly, ominously against stone. The nobleman's heart drops into a bottomless abyss. Yesterday, at a secret night meeting, he had carelessly dropped a short phrase about taxes being too high. He naively thought he was speaking among loyal, old friends. But the Empire does not believe in friendship. The Empire believes only in timely denunciations. The door flies off its sturdy, forged hinges with a dull crash. A massive figure in scale armor appears on the threshold, his face hidden in the impenetrable shadow of a helmet. No unnecessary words, no formal charges, only a short, dry swing of a broad steel blade. The nobleman doesn't even have time to let out a death rattle. Blood rapidly floods the expensive Persian rugs. The officer indifferently wipes the blade on the edge of a thin curtain and silently vanishes into the stifling night. The life of any local prince henceforth hung on the very tip of a Persian spear. Could you sleep peacefully, knowing for certain that your personal bodyguard answers not to you, but to a distant paranoiac on a golden throne? An atmosphere of oppressive, total control covered the country like a heavy shroud. Quiet, creeping terror locked the will of millions in a death grip. Secret, extrajudicial executions became a mundane bureaucratic routine. This was an entirely new mathematics of continuous horror. Before, they proudly counted captured enemy banners. Now, they scrupulously, like accountants, tallied the severed tongues of troublemakers. The state was rapidly turning into a giant, perfectly organized prison. Animal fear became the only law that actually worked. Secret archives swelled with new scrolls bearing the names of the doomed. Every squad leader of this elite corps now held absolute power over the lives of others. They openly reveled in this impunity, collecting the despair of others. When a patrol moved slowly through the narrow streets of ancient cities, the crowd pressed themselves into the dirty mud brick walls. People submissively lowered their eyes into the dust. To look an imperial enforcer directly in the face was to sign one's own immediate death warrant.
It was a long era of ringing, paralyzing silence, broken only by the dry thud of hobnailed boots. The elite enforcers worked swiftly. Any separatist revolt was doused with boiling pitch before the rebels could forge enough swords. But the soldiers had grown too accustomed to fighting frightened peasants. They were used to killing unarmed civilians. Martial valor had rotted away completely in the sticky luxury of endless palace intrigues. The heroes of open battles had degraded to the level of high-paid, ruthless executioners. They weren't protecting the crown from dangerous foreign invaders. They were cynically protecting it from their own people, who were exhausted by extortion. Some build castles to protect themselves from outsiders. Others build prisons to lock up their citizens. But a jailer always inevitably degrades along with his prisoner. It was precisely this smug, arrogant police complacency that became their primary, fatal vulnerability. They had spent too long slitting the throats of bound, helpless captives. They were used to absolute superiority in equipment and a legalized right to total violence. The system had grown hopelessly dull from its own impunity. When your primary enemies are trembling merchants and downtrodden slaves, your tactical skills inevitably and rapidly atrophy. The machine still looked truly colossal. Gold still gleamed blindingly on the ceremonial armor of the officers. But beneath this thick layer of polished, expensive metal, the muscles were already irrevocably rotting. Paranoia always forces even the smartest ruler to make fatal, irreparable mistakes. In his drive to tightly control every breath within his borders, Darius missed what was relentlessly maturing outside. The empire had become completely blinded by its own colossal grandeur. It arrogantly failed to notice how the rules of the game had fundamentally changed on the distant western frontiers. A policeman is exceptionally good at quickly dispersing an unorganized mob. But any policeman becomes absolutely useless against a motivated soldier
trained to stand to the death. While secret agents were sniffing out imaginary conspiracies in quiet Babylonian alleys, copper was clanging heavily on the stony shores of distant Greece. There, a force was being methodically forged that recognized no imperial authority and did not fear numerical superiority. And soon, this bloated, lazy secret police would collide at full speed with a harsh reality where their vaunted fear no longer worked. A reality where ringing Persian gold could not stop the dull, bone-breaking impact of a heavy hoplite shield. The illusion of absolute invincibility was hurtling toward its inevitable crash. The weight of the enemy's bronze shield proved to be the very iron argument that could not be filed into a palace interrogation transcript. The dull clang of the advancing phalanx forever shattered the cozy, nurtured myth of Persian invincibility. By the end of 490 BC, the self-assured imperial armada landed on the stony shore of Marathon. They didn't come here to fight. They showed up to conduct a routine punitive operation. High commanders yawned lazily in cool silk tents, anticipating easy loot. The system had smoothly deployed light infantry on the flanks, hastily recruited from disenfranchised slaves and intimidated vassals. The Golden Elite, the famed 10,000, waited languidly in a tight reserve. They expected the usual, 100 times rehearsed scenario. Any moment now, the pathetic peasants would flee in animal terror from a hail of arrows, and they would simply methodically finish off the tired and the stragglers. This wasn't even planned as a battle. It was a boring administrative procedure in the fresh air. But the Aegean Sea smelled of something other than the usual submission that day. It reeked of an impending, unthinkable catastrophe. The Athenian hoplites did not wait despondently for the Persian archers to shoot them down with impunity from a safe distance. They broke all the unwritten rules of ancient warfare. They ran. A solid wall, bristling with heavy bronze and made up of thousands of enraged men, surged forward with a frightening, rising roar. These were not intimidated Babylonian merchants. These were enraged owners of their own stony land, who had absolutely nowhere to retreat. What would you do, clearly understanding that your children are huddling in fear behind you, while ruthless imperial executioners with empty eyes are marching ahead? The Athenians answered this silent question with a fierce, inhuman howl. The impact. A short pause. The sound of breaking bones. The light Persian flanks burst instantly, like a rotten abscess under a heavy boot. Cheap wicker shields shattered into tiny splinters under the relentless weight of bronze rims. The tip of the fused Greek tactics gored deep into the soft belly of the sluggish imperial machine. The thick air was instantly filled with the piercing, panicked screams of the crown's vassals being trampled alive. And at that very moment, the main, ugliest flaw of the great Persian conveyor belt was exposed to the world. The perfectly drilled elite, standing monumentally in the center, suddenly froze. The machine glitched. They were absolutely unprepared for bloody chaos. A veteran of the Immortal Corps convulsively grips the damp handle of his short spear. His pupils are dilated from primal, paralyzing shock. He stands in the third row of a perfect, geometrically precise rectangle. Around him, similarly disciplined living machines breathe steadily and shallowly. But right before his eyes, the system built over years is rapidly collapsing. To the left and right, thousands of screaming allies are fleeing in blind, uncontrollable panic. The hoplites, methodically and relentlessly, like giant iron pincers, are closing their flanks, taking the vaunted elite in a death grip. The veteran desperately waits for a saving maneuver. He waits for the officer to bark a sharp order to regroup, to strike the flank, to show even a shred of initiative. But there is no order.
The rigid regulations did not account for the enemy deviating from the approved rules. Years of barracks drilling had burned the very capacity to think out of them. They only knew how to march in a straight line. They could only blindly crush with mass those who were already broken. The veteran feels sticky, foul-smelling sweat flooding his inflamed eyes. For the first time in his pampered life, he realizes his own utter helplessness. He is merely a very expensive, richly decorated target in a closed shooting gallery. Tactical rigidity turned into a literal meat grinder. The golden hounds of the crown were transformed overnight into pathetic, silent spectators of their own total collapse. They physically could not turn around. They did not dare to break their formation on their own just to save themselves by fleeing. The heavy Greek infantry methodically ground them down, crunching them into the sticky coastal mud along with their fabulous pay and haughty imperial arrogance. The fine-tuned state mechanism jammed solid the moment a single gear failed to follow the approved blueprint. The legendary mathematical replaceability of fallen warriors instantly lost all meaning when they began to be killed by the hundreds every minute. Bureaucrats abandoned their lists in a panic. The illusion of immortality choked on salty blood with a gurgle. The remnants of the elite forces slunk back toward their ships, bobbing on the waves. Driven by animal terror, they trampled one another, desperate to save their own hides and the pathetic scraps of looted gold. The grand myth of total global dominance was shattered against a tight-knit phalanx of motivated madmen. A massive empire received a stinging, humiliating rebuke that would ring in its ears for decades. Some naively buy their soldiers' loyalty with exorbitant gold. Others are born free on barren land. But when heavy bronze slams into fragile wood, no bank account can stop a split skull. The survivors brought back fear, not glory. But the Empire never forgives humiliation. It demands a bloody reckoning. And that reckoning was to take place where sheer cliffs left no room for cowardly maneuvers. The narrow pass of Thermopylae became the stone throat that nearly choked the massive empire to death. Xerxes didn't just bring a trained army to these sheer cliffs. He drove a roaring ocean of ambition. But any ocean is powerless when forced through the eye of a needle. To the left, the dark sea churned. To the right, an impregnable vertical mountain loomed. And right in the center, on a narrow strip of trampled earth, stood a locked door of Spartan bronze. 10 years after the shame of Marathon, the Crown's golden hounds were desperate for a bloody rematch. They arrogantly assumed their endless numbers would be the decisive, undeniable argument. They were catastrophically wrong. The logic of continuous replenishment suffered a monstrous, irreparable failure. What does it matter how many thousands of fresh troops stand in a monolith behind you if the width of the pass only allows a few dozen to fight at once? The overwhelming majority of the vaunted elite instantly turned into a useless, sweating mob. They shoved. They choked on the rising dust. They blindly trampled the corpses of their own comrades. King Xerxes sat on a high golden throne at a safe distance, his fists clenched in helpless, searing rage. Wave after wave, he methodically threw his most expensive investments against the red cloaks of the defenders. He truly expected a swift, crushing breakthrough. Instead, he watched the routine, systematic disposal of his own elite forces. Each new order from the king sounded more hysterical than the last. Flawless columns marched into the narrow fissure like submissive cattle into a massive slaughterhouse. They were stripped of their primary tactical edge, the ability to outflank the enemy. In this tight stone vise, ornate armor and long lists of past victories meant absolutely nothing. Gold doesn't parry spear thrusts. The elite rotted alive in this meat grinder. An enemy trained to stand to the death methodically turned the vaunted numbers of the attackers into dry daily casualty statistics. The Spartan phalanx operated like a giant, soulless machine. A heavy spear thrust, the crack of a punctured scale cuirass, a dull thud as a body hit the ground, a short step forward. And so it went, for hours on end, until the sun dipped below the horizon. A private in the Immortal Corps cannot take a single step back. The rear ranks push forward relentlessly and blindly, squeezing him right against the wall bristling with bronze. The sickening, sweet smell of fresh entrails and rusty scale hits his nose. He swings his short sword. At that exact moment, the heavy, bronze-rimmed edge of an enemy shield snaps his shin with a crunch. Sharp, pulsing pain shoots through his entire body. He falls into the slick, blood-soaked mud. Immediately, the boots of his own comrades close over him. They don't even look down. The Imperial machine ruthlessly stomps him into the dirt. He suffocates under the weight of dozens of feet. In his final seconds, he clearly grasps the cold truth. His life is worth absolutely nothing. He is just a pathetic piece of meat thrown into the insatiable maw of someone else's political blunder. How would you feel, realizing that your vaunted elite status is just a fancy word for the most expensive dead men walking on the planet?
The Persians' aura of military superiority evaporated rapidly in that suffocating stone trap. They couldn't break the rigid defense. They couldn't show tactical flexibility. They could only die methodically and submissively. The great king was in an absolute, paralyzing stalemate. His perfect assembly line proved utterly useless against basic military discipline. Salvation came from where the bloated empire was used to winning its greatest victories. It didn't come from the clash of swords, but from the quiet rustle of purchased betrayal. A local shepherd sold the invaders a secret goat path for a heavy handful of silver. Under the cover of thick night, Asia's finest warriors slunk around the flank like common thieves to strike the handful of exhausted defenders in the back. They didn't defeat the Spartans in a fair, open fight. They bought this dubious triumph at the cost of a filthy, humiliating conspiracy. The greatest army of the ancient world was saved from total disgrace by a common, destitute peasant who just wanted to eat well at the king's table. The vaunted corps merely finished off the surrounded heroes in silence, like a pack of hyenas pouncing on a wounded lion. Some spin beautiful legends about their boundless imperial might. Others just buy the necessary maps from greedy locals. But when a bloated myth hits harsh reality, all that's left is dented armor. The corps survived. It silently digested these colossal losses. But the system, built over years, developed a deep, fatal crack. The officers stopped believing in their master's divine infallibility forever. The golden chains around their necks became unbearably heavy, and loyalty turned into a cheap commodity. The soldiers finally realized that their blind oaths to the monarch guaranteed neither glory nor personal safety. The killing machine lost its original, sacred purpose.
And when the external borders temporarily stabilized, this massive, ruthless, amoral force predictably began looking for a new, more generous master. Absolute cynicism has no nationality and holds no respect for old state treaties. Sooner or later, a perfectly forged weapon will inevitably turn against its own short-sighted creators. It was only a matter of waiting for the moment when the ruler's internal ambitions would tear the country apart, and mass fratricide would become just another routine line item on the daily payroll. While abandoned Spartan shields slowly rusted on distant rocky frontiers, the very foundation of the great empire was rapidly rotting at its heart. By the end of 401 BC, the concept of military honor had finally become a hollow, meaningless sound. The system of continuous death replenishment suddenly grew hungry. It cynically decided to devour itself. Two arrogant brothers locked in a death grip over their father's golden throne. The princes craved absolute power with an animal intensity, and for this filthy family feud, they urgently needed the state's best attack dogs. The legendary elite corps was cold-bloodedly split right down the middle. Yesterday's brothers-in-arms stood on opposite sides of the dry, lifeless plain at Cunaxa. The once great elite became common, interchangeable cannon fodder in someone else's political game. Forget the lofty ballads about sacred duty to the beloved motherland. The Battle of Cunaxa was the absolute apotheosis of pure, naked imperial cynicism. Flawless loyalty, forged by decades of brutal barracks drill, was brazenly put up for auction. Whoever poured more silver into the soldiers' field chests would become the new legitimate ruler of half the world. The senior commander's orders sounded mundane and incredibly dry. They publicly admitted that their subordinates' oaths were easily sold to suit the moment. The machine, nurtured for years, began to methodically grind its own steel gears with a horrific screech. The perfect mechanism of state control turned into a banal, bloated gang of high-priced mercenaries. They were no longer defending the Empire's vast borders. They were defending nothing but the exorbitant, bloated ambitions of two spoiled princes. A soldier leans heavily on the edge of his wicker shield. The unbearable noon sun ruthlessly melts his mind. Right in front of him, in the dense enemy line, stands an identical man. The same expensive scale armor, the same rigid, regulation grip on a short spear. The soldier recognizes those deep scars on the other man's forearm perfectly. 10 years ago, choking back tears, they ate raw rats together in filthy training pits. They slept on the frozen ground, warming each other back to back. Now, a senior officer dryly commands him to kill this man. The soldier doesn't even try to ask questions. He makes a sharp, practiced lunge forward. The bronze blade pierces his former comrade's neck with a soft crunch. Hot blood sprays thick across the killer's face. He feels not the slightest remorse. He feels nothing at all. A childhood erased in death camps has borne its poisonous fruit. Before the battle, the officers strongly advised simply not looking into the eyes of those they were to cold-bloodedly butcher. Heavy gold coins weigh pleasantly on his leather belt. The death of a sworn brother is now just a routine bureaucratic procedure to collect the next bonus. Could you sleep soundly on soft silk pillows, knowing exactly that you bought them with the life of your best friend? On this dusty, cursed day, the legendary corps lost its soul forever. 10,000 perfect machines divided to savagely butcher one another for someone else's stupid vanity. The moral decay of the once invincible guard hit rock bottom. As a Greek mercenary who miraculously survived that meat grinder bitterly recorded, "They hacked at their own reflections in the mirror, sincerely hoping the shattered glass would bring them power, but they only got their hands cut to ribbons." Stupid rulers, blinded by pride, naively believe the army belongs to them personally. But an army completely stripped of a sacred purpose belongs only to its own bottomless greed. The mass fratricide at Cunaxa didn't just thin the dense ranks of the illustrious elite. It finally and irrevocably devalued the very essence of their existence. Senior commanders fastidiously wiped bloodied swords on expensive cloaks and hastily rewrote empty rosters. Formally, the Empire continued to exist, but it was already terminally, incurably ill. Some rulers spend a long time painfully forging the perfect sword to protect their fragile home. Others mindlessly hack at their own legs in a fit of paranoid rage. The state system, rotting alive, still tried to appear as an indestructible fortress.
But when the living, obedient parts of a single mechanism get used to devouring one another with such indifference, the entire colossus will inevitably fall apart at the first sharp turn of history. And that fatal turn was already relentlessly approaching. From the west, a cold, piercing wind of coming change began to blow, carrying with it the faint but inevitable scent of Macedonian bronze. The scent of Macedonian bronze proved fatal for those who had breathed only sweet palace incense for too long. When two completely different eras clashed on the scorched, dusty plains of Issus and Gaugamela, the world didn't see a great, noble collision of equal titans. The world saw a pathetic, incredibly humiliating beating of a system rotted to the core. Alexander the Great didn't play by the old, stiff rules of the sluggish East. He brought hungry, angry, and phenomenally motivated fighters, for whom Persian gold was merely legitimate loot, not a valid argument in a tactical dispute. The legendary Immortals, hopelessly fattened on triple pay and completely blinded by their own internal impunity, didn't take the field to win. They came out to sullenly guard their giant baggage trains, stuffed to the brim with looted luxury. The machine, forged centuries ago by the insanely pragmatic Cyrus for total dominance, now creaked pathetically and fell apart under the unbearable weight of its own vices. The dull, methodical thud of long Macedonian sarissas lanced this bloated golden abscess with one ruthless strike. The illusion of absolute imperial might popped instantly, spraying sticky, paralyzing fear everywhere. Darius III, the cowardly lord of half the known world, didn't wait for a heroic finale. As soon as the sharp Macedonian wedge crunched through the first breach in his mercenary defense, he turned his luxurious chariot and fled in a shameful, panicked rout. And what did his vaunted, invincible elite guard do in that critical second? Those same 10,000 perfect killing machines whose loyalty had been seared into them for years with red-hot irons in filthy death camps. Those who had loudly sworn to stand to the death against any threat. They simply ran after him. Enraged masters turned in an instant into a pathetic, bleating herd, ready to abandon all their greatness just to save their own worthless lives. A heavy scale cuirass of pure gold presses unbearably on slumped shoulders. Hot breath wheezes from a parched throat clogged with sand. Yesterday's arrogant imperial enforcer, whose icy stare once struck animal terror into entire rebellious provinces, now clumsily stumbles over the bleeding corpses of his own comrades. He clearly hears the steady, inevitable thud of Macedonian cavalry behind him. Sticky horror completely paralyzes his will. With shaking, filthy hands, he frantically unbuckles the leather straps of his ornate helmet and hurls it into the road dust with loathing. Then he sheds his useless shield. He drops the heavy sword with its jewel-encrusted hilt. He runs, pathetic, unarmed, and utterly broken, choking on his own bitter spit and the thick dust kicked up by his cowardly king's wheels. All his years of inhuman drill, all his empty oaths, all his hollow grandeur are being ruthlessly trampled into the dirt right now by the conqueror's coarse sandals. The myth of absolute, unshakable loyalty died, letting out one last pathetic, ragged whimper in the bloody mud. The defeat was not just crushing, it was total, shameful, and absolutely irreversible. The greatest military machine of antiquity crumbled to dust forever, leaving behind not a single bright, heroic epic. But the young victors proved far more calculating and cynical than the defeated old men. Alexander the Great didn't systematically butcher the surviving traitors to the crown. Why mindlessly break a useful tool, even if it's a bit rusty and covered in shame? The Macedonian king cold-bloodedly assimilated the remnants of this broken core,
folding them forever into his own surging army. The surviving imperial hounds submissively bowed their heads to a new, more aggressive master, without a single word of protest. With dog-like readiness, they donned Macedonian clothes and took up strange, unfamiliar weapons. Their sham loyalty was successfully bought once again, proving to the world that for a perfect, hollowed-out mercenary, it makes no difference whose arrogant face is minted on his heavy silver coin. The Macedonians stole the most valuable thing from their defeated enemy. They didn't just take their vast, fertile lands and bottomless state treasuries. They cynically stole their only genuine historical achievement, the very idea of a faceless, foolproof army assembly line.
The very philosophy of industrial warfare, where a living human is reduced to an entirely interchangeable part in a massive, blind mechanism of suppression. This chilling state pragmatism successfully outlived its arrogant creators by many millennia. The great empire fell ignobly, but its poisonous, blood-soaked seeds bore incredibly abundant fruit in every subsequent state that imagined itself the sole arbiter of the world's fate. Some build their indestructible empires on the mangled bones of strangers. Others erect them on the smoking ruins of their own moral ideals. But the soulless conveyor of death always continues its methodical work, only occasionally changing the colors of its tattered banners. The temple of their pride was razed to its rotten foundation, leaving not even a tiny shard of stone from its former splendor. Born in blood and the cynical betrayal of their legitimate masters, they ended their long historical journey with the same pathetic, cowardly treachery, becoming forever nothing but a dry, insignificant footnote in the chronicle of someone else's grand triumph. A colossal system created solely to inspire paralyzing animal terror ultimately devoured itself methodically, choking forever on its own exorbitant greed and the political degradation of its lords. And now, looking closely at these withered pages of human history, soaked through with cold calculation and loyalty bought with gold, answer quite honestly, has our nature changed so fundamentally over these cruel millennia, or have we simply learned to sew more beautiful and comfortable uniforms for our modern, submissive armies?